It's been 30 years since the Granada name was last used on the back of a big executive Ford, it being replaced in '94 by the Scorpio, which itself was phased out 4 years later. So it's hard to imagine when this was new, the Mk2, the Granada was very much part of the top 10 sellers list here in the UK, peaking in 1979 at number 7. So why did Ford ultimately bow out of the big executive market? And did the Mk2 deserve its commercial success? Well, we've got this fantastic V6 Ghia example here to find out. So as we've covered before, the Mk1 Granada came out in 1972, replacing the much maligned Zephyr and Zodiac range. And in fact, we've done a road test on the Mk1 Granada, which you'll see in another video. But whereas that iconic original was built both here in the UK and in Germany, its Mk2 replacement was only built in Germany. Had a radical makeover. The exterior was massively different to that original car, and I would argue a less successful outcome, as it's a slightly more bland result. But it did mean that the exterior had a family resemblance, very similar to the Mk5 Cortina or the Cortina 80, the Mk3 Escort and the Mk1 Fiesta. But as with any good Ford makeover, the radical exterior hid very much familiar mechanicals underneath. Pretty much everything from the Mk1 was carried over. The big exception was the 3-litre Essex V6 engine, which was replaced by the Cologne V6 in 2.3 and 2.8 capacities. There was a carburettor model, and the top spec models had Bosch K-Jectronic fuel injection. There was double wishbone suspension up front, fully independent rear. There was ventilated front discs and power-assisted rack and pinion steering. It was very well engineered. It was a good car, thoroughly and competently engineered. It was available as a 4-door saloon or a 5-door estate, and you could have a 4-speed manual gearbox or a 3-speed auto. So the formula was good. It seemed to work. And indeed, contemporary road tests of the day were very flattering of the Mk2 Granada. A contemporary road test of 1977 said that the steering of the Mk2 Granada was superb, while the handling was, and I quote, as good if not better than a BMW 7 Series. That's quite a claim. And driving along here today in this V6 Ghia model, it's actually meant to be a 2.8, but this particular model's got a 2.9 V6 from the later Sierras, mainly because it's so heavy. But it's absolutely joyous. I absolutely love it. There's such an unpretentious nature about the Granada, which I just really like. The V6 engine it's not particularly quick, particularly this one, because this one weighs over 2.5 tons, this particular example. Standard spec cars weighed about 1,300 kilos, and which is not a lot more than a modern Mini by today's standards, which is outrageous. But anyway, it doesn't feel particularly quick, but there's a purposeful roar from that Cologne V6 engine. It's smooth and yet got a gruff purpose to it, a bit of grunt, which makes it feel like it could go on forever. It feels indestructible. It's actually pleasantly refined. These seats are absolutely delicious. They're so comfortable. I feel like I could sit in these for days. The steering is actually quite light. There's not a lot of feel to it, but it doesn't matter. If you're just wafting along, just enjoy the journey. It's actually surprisingly refined. I love the interior. It's actually quite plasticky by modern standards, but all the switch gear is beautifully laid out. There's the very distinctive gauges from the Ford era. I've got a rev counter, fuel gauge and temperature gauge, and a speedometer. I've got column stalks all to hand. I've got vents. I've got auxiliary gauges here for oil, pressure and battery. It all just really works. It's a really nice package. A later road test which pitched the Mk2 Granada against the more modern Volvo 740 and the older Peugeot 504 actually put the Granada second, but made a very good point that it was a very competent all-rounder. And it really was. Almost no matter what engine you had, whether you had the 2-litre Pinto or one of the V6s, or dare I say even one of these sluggish Peugeot sourced diesel engines, they were good cars to drive. They were solid, they were dependable. There was no muss or fuss with the Granada. You just got what you paid for. Nothing more, nothing less. There was a subtle facelift in 1981 which saw some new colour schemes, new alloy wheel designs, a new steering wheel, and the fascia was subtly reworked with some updated switchgear. This is one of those facelifted models. And by the end of the model's life, there was pretty much a an addition to suit everyone from L, LX, GL, Ghia, Ghia X. There was even a Ghia X Executive, I think, at one point. But the car soldiered on for 7 or 8 years. It was replaced in 1985 by the Mk2 Granada, at which point it was called the Scorpio in some markets. It was still called the Granada here in the UK, right up until 1994 when the Scorpio name took over. But the Mk2 was definitely the heyday. That was the peak period where the Granada was regularly in the top 10 list here in the UK. And it's a shame that the Granada hasn't endured in that same way. Ford today is so different to the Ford back then when it dominated the sales charts. The Granada was part of that halcyon time, part of that success story, I suppose. And it's such a shame that that's no longer the case. I grew up with Granadas. They were regular street furniture when I was a kid. A dad of a friend of mine had a Granada, and I loved being a passenger in that car. We went up to Birmingham to the motor show in it one year, and I just really enjoyed it. The Granada was regular fodder on TV. Spikings was chauffeured around one in Dempsey and Makepeace. There was a regular fixture on Minder and the Sweeney, Inspector Morse, all these sort of TV icons. So a little bit of background on this particular car. This car belongs to a guy called Mark who's owned it for about 10 years now, and it's actually an ex-MOD car. So it's got armour plating in the doors and it's got really thick double-skinned bulletproof glass. So this one feels even more solid than a regular Granada. That's why it weighs so much. It's over 2.5 tons. But what a car! It's absolutely spectacular. This one's got 86,000 miles on the clock, and it still drives brilliantly. You can definitely feel the weight. It's not making any major progress, but yeah, it's smooth, it's refined, effortlessly comfy. This is a billiard table smooth surface, but nonetheless, it just cruises along. I think you could cover many, many miles in this. So yeah, I think it's a shame that the Granada is no longer part of Ford's makeup. Ford pulled out of that big executive sector when the Scorpio died off in '98, and I think that's a real shame. But why did it? Why did they pull out of the executive sector? Well, I guess it could be a combination of things, and certainly at least one of the factors has got to be the fact that the more prestigious German marques, the Mercedes, BMWs and Audis of the time, have just become more readily available. Thanks to things like better company car schemes and more finance packages, people can get into one of those prestige brands for not a lot more than you could an equivalent Ford. So why spend £300 a month buying a Ford when for £320 a month you might have got yourself into a BMW 5 Series or a Mercedes E-Class? So yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame that Ford are no longer active in that big executive category, because the Granada is such a lovely beast. I love its unpretentiousness. It's comfortable, it's refined, it does everything well. It's a good car, probably underrated because of that badge on the front. But I definitely miss the Granada. It's part of our heritage, it's part of a golden age for Ford. I really do miss it.